In this video, we're going to take a look at why the engine does not start when we turn the key. Many things can cause the engine to not start during cycling of the key. For example, a low amperage battery will perform the same demonstration you're about to witness in this video. Also, loose connection and a worn out ignition switch can cause the same issue that you are about to experience in this video. We have already zeroed down the problem to be the starter due to previous tests that we have performed to the starting system. You could go to these related videos to make related tests to zero down your problem. But first, let's turn the key to the start position and see what happens. So what we have just experienced is a slow cranking startup. A slow cranking startup can be the cause of a poor performing battery, loss of ground connection, worn out starter bushing, worn out starter brushes, a defective starter solenoid, a broken starter bendix, and other component relating to the starting system. Let's try to start the engine again to see if we experience the same problem. And as we are currently experiencing the same slow startup condition. Most of the time, a battery will mislead you to think that this slow startup is happening. What we are currently experiencing in our startup is a poor connection, and a poor connection can exist anywhere from the ignition switch all the way to the battery terminal, including the starter connection and the engine ground connection. Let's try for another startup to see if the engine will successfully start itself. So eventually, the engine will start if you keep cycling the key for a starting command. So you can learn the noise in the event of future repairs. Let's remove the positive cable from the battery. Now that we're going to be removing the starter, we do not want to leave the battery terminal connected, because during removal of the starter, the terminal behind the starter solenoid can become contact with the ground and cause a fire. By detaching this splash guard from the wheel well, and when we look inside the engine compartment, we will see that wire that's connected to the starter. So we have to disconnect this heavy cable from the positive battery terminal. We also have to disconnect the solenoid wire from its harness plug. This plug right here, we will have to unstrap it from the main harness and disconnect it. If you do not choose to remove the wheel to access the solenoid wire harness, which is located right here, you can remove the rock guard from the front of the vehicle below the radiator, and this is what you will notice. to make your repair. Here is what the plug looked like after you pass it from behind the motor mount flange. I was able to pass it with the zip tie attached, but you might not want to risk so, because you could risk breaking the plastic. So when you're going to have to unzip this tie, you're going to have to lift this tab right here up. You're going to have to push it up and then pull back on the tab itself. It's going to require 2 hands and a little effort. So now that we have this wire disconnected, we're going to move to detaching the bolt from the heavy positive cable. So we're going to use a 13mm combination wrench. We want to use the box end first, and you want to make sure you don't go in the wrong direction when you're turning this nut, because you risk breaking the terminal from the solenoid of the starter. So the reason I don't want to use the box end is because it has a little piece of plastic here, and the box will just kind of break this plastic, so you have to watch out for it. So like everything else on the Nissan, this is not an easy location to access. At 100,000 miles, most Nissan will become very problematic. So you have to become a very good tech or a mechanic to maintain your vehicle. So this nut also have a washer with it. You have to make sure you get it. It's a lock washer. Then we will simply just push the heavy positive cable off its terminal. Now we will move to removing the starter. Now we have 2 bolts to remove from the transmission bell housing to detach the starter from the engine. And those 2 bolts are right here. We're going to start with the bottom bolt, and we're going to use our short extension with a 14mm socket. Just want to fit it onto the bottom bolt, making sure the ratchet clear the cross member support. So this piece of tool is a must for the bottom bolt. For the top bolt, we're going to use the same 14mm 6-point socket with a swivel extension. You can also use a universal like this to attach to the end of the socket where it meets the extension. This will allow the extension to flex so the socket could be perfectly seated onto the bolt. But once you have the socket on the bolt, you want to tap the extension end so the socket is seated perfectly onto the head of the bolt. Failure to do so will strip the head of the bolt, and this will cause a problem to remove the starter bolt. Once the top bolt is released and loosened to some extent, we're going to need to remove the bottom bolt completely in order to remove the top bolt. You see, the bottom bolt has to be removed first, because during the process of removing the top bolt, the starter is going to move forward, allowing the bolt to pass itself out from the transmission bell housing with the tool. This is another very tight spot to work in, so you must use some caution and patience. Now that the starter bolt is released, we have to pass the starter down in this area between the axle and its crossover member. And this is going to be a little tough, and you're going to have to be careful that you don't break the starter solenoid motor switch. You're also going to want to remember the pattern that you're sliding down the starter with, because that's going to be the same way you're going to be reinstalling the starter. You also must make sure you don't tug on this wire to damage it or disconnect it from its solenoid. So we are complete with removing the starter from the engine. Let's go take a look at what the problem could be inside the starter to cause our failure to start. Here is the starter and all the tools that we use to remove it. You will notice the curvature of the extension, which is credited to the ball extension end. This curve is required to remove these bolts from the starter and its bell housing. You could also use a universal on the end of a straight extension to do the same thing. The 13mm is to remove the starter cable bolt from the back here. So this is the second time we're removing this starter for a rebuild, and the reason we are removing it is because oil from the crankshaft rear main seal will leak into the starter and enter itself into the motor. So we're now going to go into the starter to make the necessary repair to its brushes on the back of the motor. You could go to this video here to see how to rebuild the starter and replace the brushes. So here you will notice I have the back of the starter motor release, and we can look inside the cover and we can see the brushes are basically not able to make a pressure contact with its terminal. So it's time for us to replace the brushes, and the starter will continue to operate as it normally would. So here I have the brush terminal connector removed from the starter motor backing cover, and I just want to slip this clip right here. Just want to get this out of the way so we can remove this cover for a visual inspection of the brushes, and we can see how the spring is fully extended on all of them, and that is a sign that the brushes are worn out and the spring is not providing adequate pressure to contact the armature terminals. We want to make sure we inspect the armature contact surface, make sure we clean out all in between the lines, and this surface here should be absolutely smooth. You should feel no friction or groove inside its surface. You're also going to want to rebuild the starter like I did here, re-grease it and clean up the internal, and you could go to this video here to see how to rebuild the complete starter and install its new brushes. Here is the distributor for the new brush communicator that we're going to install into the starter. So when we look at the new brush communicator, we can see it has a different brush in compare to the old one that we replaced. The old one is more of a black composite, and the new one is more of a copper material. So in order for us to prepare this brush communicator for installation, so this part here is going to be the back of the brush communicator facing the rear of the starter, and this part here is going to go forward like this. But we must compress these brushes inside the communicator to make the installation. So what I first want to do is I want to take this 7/8 socket and I just want to wedge it in here. Once I have the socket fitted inside the brush communicator, I will now take this same socket. You must pay attention to the installation and notice these two little clips have to face the back, because this is where the bolt is going to attach the brush communicator to the motor rear cover, and this part is going to get placed simply against the armature, and we will push on the armature to fit the brush communicator perfectly to the armature communicator. You see, you could use a pick to set the brushes onto the armature, but this will most likely damage the brushes. So this is another way for installing the brush communicator using this 7/8 socket. So now we must position our brush communicator so the wire, the positive terminal wire, seat inside the motor case groove. Now we will take the motor cover, and you can see this is the old cardboard from our previous installation. I've also painted the cover inside and out to prevent future rust, and we have applied new grease to the bushing bearing. So let's place the cover with this notch aligning to the wire terminal. So I will attach my clamping bolt. This bolt clamps the back cover, the coil field, against the starter housing planetary casing. Once the brush communicator has been completely installed and the rear cover is attached, we want to pay attention to how we install our motor solenoid. We must make sure our terminal is positioned correctly. So we want the solenoid cable to be at 3 o'clock, our battery cable to be at 12 o'clock, and the motor terminal to be at 6 o'clock. We must not forget this position. We are complete with the installation. Now we're going to go and install the starter into the vehicle and continue driving. But we must repair the crankshaft rear main oil seal to prevent this excessive worn to the brushes inside the starter. When the oil leaks past that seal from the crankshaft and enter into the transmission bell housing, it will enter inside the starter from this Bendix gear, and eventually it will end inside the electric portion of the motor, even though the motor has a drainage for that on the bottom. The oil will then saturate these brushes and wear out much quicker than they normally would. We will now reinstall the refurbished starter, and if it continue to persist with the same action, demonstrating the same sound, we will then have to replace the electric portion of the starter motor. Sometimes the coil field inside the armature and the magnet, which is stuck to the outside casing cage, will become weak in its static ability, and this will cause a weak motor. So We will then proceed and replace this electric portion if the starter continues to give us a fail condition after checking all terminal connection and battery voltage. Before we can install the starter, we must first inspect the flywheel or the flex plate. We want to inspect the tooth on the ring gear for the flywheel, making sure all the teeth are identical and no missing tooth. We will rotate the flywheel or flex plate by turning the center bolt on the crankshaft harmonic balancer, which is located on the front of the engine. You will need a partner to do so, because all the tooth on the flex plate must be in place and correctly in place to engage the starter Bendix pinion gear. Failure to any of the flex plate teeth will cause a problem with starting the engine and engaging the Bendix starter pinion gear. That is one full rotation of the flywheel, and we can notice all the tooth are identical. And as we can also notice, the oil from the engine is dripping off of the flywheel. This is a sign that the crankshaft rear main seal is leaking. This leaking oil will dump itself into the transmission housing and eventually whip itself around with the flywheel and enter the starter. This oil will saturate the starter brushes, contributing to a increased wear and tear situation. So we must now proceed and install the engine starter and then repair the crankshaft rear main oil seal. Let's now take a look at installing the starter, and the only way to pass it up is to pass this wire up first. Then we will hold the starter at this angle, making sure that we do not damage the solenoid wire. So we want to make sure that the starter is seated perfectly to the transmission case. It will sometimes hang onto the axle, but that's okay. Once we're ready to install the bolt, we will hold this side of the starter with our hand and turn and twist it to make sure we can align the bolt with the starter. The starter anchoring bolt will be replaced the same way they were removed, with the same tool. We must also check the connection at the starter solenoid, and as we can see, we have our connection made, but we have changed the position of the starter solenoid during installation. Here again is another incorrect way to install the starter solenoid. We can see that this heavy positive cable extends too much next to the frame rail. So in the event of a broken motor mount, when the engine is to lift up, this positive terminal will touch the frame rail and most likely cause a fire. As we can see, the two bolts should be on the opposite side, and this terminal should be on the bottom of the solenoid. So we will have to relocate the solenoid. So this solenoid wire is on the bottom and the two terminals is on the opposite side. We cannot leave this connection like this because these two terminals are too close together and could most likely short-circuited. Also, if the motor mount is to become broken, when the engine should tilt to the right side of the engine bay, it will most likely come in contact with the frame and the solenoid wire. This is the correct position for the solenoid and the starter. We will notice that the positive terminal is on the outside, but it does not so much close to the frame rail. And the inside is the motor terminal. We must also feel up in here and make sure that the solenoid wire is not pressed against the positive battery cable. We will cover the bolt. If the positive battery cable is to come in contact with the solenoid wire, when the vehicle is start, the starter will remain hung up onto the flywheel. You will immediately have to disconnect the battery terminal. You will immediately have to disconnect the positive terminal from the battery to free the starter from the flywheel in the event it should get hung up on the flywheel during startup. Let's now go and try out the starter by cycling the key a couple times to start the engine. The starter solenoid can now be reattached and plugged together. It is very important that that solenoid wire is kept away from the exhaust manifold and reposition itself between the engine mount, bracket, and the engine block. Once we are finished installing the solenoid harness and attach its plug to the main harness with the zip tie, we will then reattach our splash guard. This splash guard is very important because it prevents water from splashing up inside the engine bay and getting in contact with the exhaust manifold. This procedure is easier done with the wheel removed.